The universe operates on principles we understand: energy, matter, the fundamental constants that bind reality together. Ki flows through living beings like blood through veins, measurable, detectable, a language the universe speaks fluently. But what happens when something arrives that the universe has never learned to read? What happens when darkness itself steps through a crack in the world and smiles? Earth, 2026 by the Western calendar. The Cell Games had begun 3 days ago. The perfect being had issued his challenge to the world's greatest warriors, and humanity trembled beneath the weight of inevitable destruction. Cities lay half evacuated. Television broadcasts flickered between emergency alerts and Cell's arena, broadcasting catastrophe as entertainment. The sky above the tropical islands carried that particular quality of wrongness that precedes apocalypse, too still, too golden, the clouds refusing to move as if the atmosphere itself held its breath. It was into this stillness that the rift appeared. No warning. No scientific precursor. No key signature that Bulma's Dragon radar or any Capsule Corporation instrument could have detected. One moment the sky above a ruined highway 40 kilometers north of the arena was empty. The next, reality simply tore, a vertical wound in the air, bleeding darkness and something older than darkness, something that had existed before light decided it wanted to be a permanent feature of the cosmos. 3 figures fell through. The first hit the cracked asphalt and stood immediately, as if falling from dimensional rifts was a minor inconvenience ranking somewhere below finding an empty parking space. He was tall, dressed in an almost theatrical combination of red coat and wide-brimmed hat, orange-tinted glasses catching the alien sunlight and doing absolutely nothing to make him look less dangerous. He surveyed the devastation around him. Crumbled highway barriers, abandoned vehicles, distant columns of smoke. With the expression of a man who had seen worse before breakfast. Alucard, the no-life king, last weapon of the Hellsing organization, smiled. Not a pleasant smile. The kind of smile that contains too many teeth and absolutely none of the warmth that smiles are supposed to carry. He breathed in slowly, tasting the air with senses that had been sharpening for 5 centuries, and something in the atmosphere made him pause. There was energy here. Not the spiritual pressure he recognized from his own world's demons and monsters. Something else. Something that hummed at a frequency his devoured souls had never encountered, vibrating in his chest like a second heartbeat that wasn't his. Interesting. The second figure landed harder, boots cracking asphalt in a spiderweb pattern, blonde hair loose and wild from the transit. Seras Victoria straightened, her massive left arm, darkness compressed into something approximating flesh. Shifting and settling like a creature waking from sleep. Her red eyes swept the environment with the tactical efficiency of a former police officer and the heightened perception of a vampire who had finally, fully embraced what she was. She smelled smoke, fierce sweat baked into abandoned upholstery, and beneath everything, that strange humming energy that her master had already noticed. "Master," she said quietly. "Where are we?" "Not where we were," Alucard replied, which was unhelpful and entirely intentional. The third figure hit the road and immediately drove 3 blessed bayonets into the asphalt, using them as anchors, using them as a statement. Alexander Anderson rose to his full considerable height, white gloves already materializing fresh blades between his fingers, green eyes burning with the particular intensity of a man who measured every situation against the yardstick of God's will and found most situations wanting. His coat was torn from the transit. A long cut across his cheek was already closing. Blessed regeneration stitching his flesh back together in real time. He looked at Alucard. Alucard looked at him. The same look they always exchanged. The acknowledgement of 2 beings who existed in permanent opposition, who fought because the universe apparently required that they fight, who had nonetheless arrived here together and would deal with that philosophical inconvenience later. "This is not London," Anderson observed. Remarkable deduction, Paladin. Silence, monster. Seras stepped between them with the practiced ease of someone who had learned that her master and Anderson's arguments could level city blocks if left unmanaged. Can we perhaps determine where we actually are before you two start? The sound reached them before the answer did. A low, powerful displacement of air that shouldn't have been moving that quickly. And then a figure in an orange GI was simply there, standing 20 meters away, dark eyes moving between the three strangers with an expression that somehow combined complete alertness with genuine friendly curiosity. Son Goku had sensed the energy disturbance from the arena, had instant transmitted before he'd fully decided to, and was now confronting three beings whose power he could feel pressing against his perception like a sound just below hearing. He couldn't read their ki. He could feel that they were powerful. He could feel the wrongness of their energy, the way it didn't behave like ki should behave, the way it seemed to exist in the space between energy states rather than within them. His Saiyan instincts, honed through death and resurrection and transformations that had cracked planets, were telling him something he'd never heard them say before. These three were dangerous in a way he didn't have a category for. He raised his hand in greeting, because Goku's first response to danger had always been and would always be to see if it wanted to be friends. "Hey," he said. "I'm Goku. You're not from around here, are you?" Alucard's smile widened until it contained something that might have been genuine interest for the first time in longer than most civilizations had existed. "No," the No-Life King said. "We are not. If you want to see more characters collide with iconic anime universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a crossover you'd want to see in the comments below. Live long and prosper." Goku had faced gods. He had stared into the eyes of Frieza while a planet died beneath his feet, had traded blows with androids designed specifically to kill him, had felt the earth crack under the weight of his own power. He understood danger the way a musician understands rhythm, not intellectually, but in his bones, in the instinctive read of a situation that had kept him alive through odds that should have been impossible. But this was different. He stood on the broken highway, hands still raised in greeting, and tried to do what he always did, reach out with his senses, feel the energy signature of the beings in front of him, calibrate the threat. Ki sensing was as natural to him as breathing, a constant background process that painted the world in gradients of power. He could feel Gohan training 3 kilometers south. He could feel Vegeta's furious energy burning like a small sun at the Capsule Corporation compound. He could feel Cell, distant and nauseating, that wrongly assembled collection of the universe's greatest warriors compressed into something that had decided it was perfect. These three he could not feel. Not properly. There was something there. A pressure, like a sound at the edge of hearing, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air changes character and every animal instinct says to find shelter. But when he tried to focus on it, tried to get a reading the way he would from any other fighter, the energy slipped sideways. It didn't dissipate. It didn't hide. It simply existed in a register his senses weren't built to process, like trying to see ultraviolet light with eyes designed only for the visible spectrum. It made the Saiyan in him profoundly uncomfortable. It also made him intensely curious, because those two responses in Goku had always been essentially identical. "So you just fell out of that tear in the sky?" he asked, nodding toward where the rift had already sealed itself, leaving only a faint iridescent scar on the air that was fading even as he looked at it. "Perceptive," said the tall one in red. His voice carried harmonics that Goku's ears registered as wrong in some fundamental way, layered, as if multiple speakers were producing slightly offset versions of the same sounds. "We were engaged in a battle in our own world. Something interfered. And now we are here, in your world, which appears to be having its own difficulties." He gestured broadly at the devastation. Abandoned cars. Cracked road surfaces. The distant silhouette of destruction on every horizon. "Yeah," Goku admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "Cell. He's kind of our problem right now." "Cell," the blonde woman repeated. She was studying him with red eyes that caught the light in a way human eyes didn't, and Goku noticed that she didn't blink with anything close to human frequency. "What is Cell?" "Something that shouldn't exist. Genetic material from the strongest fighters on this planet, grown into something that calls itself perfect. He paused. It's complicated. Monsters often are, said the large man with the bayonets, and something in his tone suggested he wasn't speaking theoretically. Gohan arrived 11 seconds later, descending from the sky with his GI slightly dusty from training, and stopped 6 feet above the ground when his eyes found the 3 strangers. He had his father's instinct for reading situations and his mother's intelligence for processing them quickly. He floated there for a moment, doing the same key sensing Goku had done, getting the same confusing non-answer. "Dad," he said carefully. "Who are they?" "New arrivals. Just got here." Goku looked at the 3 strangers. "Sorry, I didn't catch your names." "Alucard." The red-coated one performed something that might have been a bow if bows were designed to imply threat. "This is Seras Victoria. The zealot with the knives is Alexander Anderson." "I am no zealot," Anderson said, in the tone of a man who had been called a zealot so many times that the word had lost all meaning. "I am a servant of God and an instrument of his justice." He looked at Gohan hovering overhead and narrowed his eyes. "You fly without wings or machinery. Explain this." "Ki," Gohan said, landing. "Energy that comes from living things. You can manipulate it if you train enough." Anderson's eyes moved to Goku, who obligingly floated 6 inches off the ground to demonstrate. The paladin watched this with the expression of a man cross-referencing what he was seeing against an internal theological database and finding the entry conspicuously absent. "Sorcery," he concluded. "Science," Gohan countered. "The distinction is one of ignorance." Seras had moved away from this exchange and was crouching near a section of shattered concrete barrier, examining the damage with professional attention. The destruction pattern was consistent, massive impact force, high velocity, the kind of damage that spoke of repeated physical violence on a scale that her experience in Hellsing's battles gave her specific reference points for. She pressed one hand to the cracked road surface and felt something she hadn't expected. The asphalt retained a trace resonance from the key that had impacted it, and her vampire senses, attuned to energies of a very different kind, could read it like Braille. "This world has fighters," she said quietly. "Real ones. Not like the ghouls or even the freaks back home." She stood and looked at Alucard. "The energy here is enormous." Alucard had not moved from his original position. He was doing what Alucard did in new situations, processing. 5 centuries of experience had given him a methodology for encountering the unknown: be still, observe, let your senses expand, let the world tell you what it was. The devoured souls within him, millions of them, the psychic residue of every being he had ever consumed, were restless. They could feel the key in the environment too. They were reacting to it the way iron filings react to a magnetic field, aligning, straining, reaching towards something unfamiliar. He found that sensation worth examining carefully. "The large fighter at the distant coordinates," he said, without turning. "The one whose energy feels like poorly contained malevolence dressed in the costume of perfection." "Cell," Goku confirmed. "He is the primary threat to this world." "Yes." "And your plan for addressing him involves a tournament." Goku blinked. "How did you?" "The arena construction is visible from here if you know how to look. The energy signatures of preparation. The particular quality of a world holding its breath before a scheduled catastrophe." Alucard finally turned, and his orange glasses caught the sunlight in a way that made his eyes impossible to read. "We have arrived in your world uninvited, Son Goku. We did not choose to be here. But we are here, and something in this universe appears to have ensured that our arrival was not accidental." Goku considered this. He had learned, through extensive and often painful experience, that the universe rarely did things accidentally. "So what do you want to do?" he asked. Alucard smiled his terrible smile. "I want," he said, "to meet this thing that calls itself perfect." Anderson had decided, within the first 20 minutes of arriving in this universe, that it was heretical. Not in the comfortable, manageable way that most of the world was heretical, the ordinary human failing of imperfect faith, of weakness and sin that could be addressed with Scripture and, when Scripture proved insufficient, with blessed steel. This was something more fundamental. This universe operated on principles that placed human potential at the center of its theology. Men who could crack mountains with their fists. Children who floated above the ground and discussed energy manipulation with the casual familiarity of breathing. Power on a scale that the Vatican's most ancient texts had reserved exclusively for the divine, distributed here among mortals like it was simply a matter of sufficient training. It offended him on a level that went below doctrine and touched something older. Something that had been forged in the orphanages of the Iscariot organization, in the understanding that power without God at its center was the most dangerous thing in existence. He left without announcing his departure, because Anderson had never considered it necessary to explain himself to vampires or to warriors from alien worlds. He simply walked, and then when walking seemed insufficient, he ran, his regenerating body moving at speeds that would have been superhuman by any standard his own world possessed, eating kilometers of broken highway with a ground-devouring stride that scattered his white coat behind him like a banner. He needed to understand this world on his own terms. The first settlement he reached was a small town 40 kilometers from the arena, half evacuated, perhaps a third of its population still present, the ones who had nowhere else to go, or the ones whose stubbornness outweighed their self-preservation instinct. Anderson recognized both categories. He had spent his life among people who stayed when they should have fled. A church. Of course there was a church. There was always a church, in Anderson's experience, because humanity's instinct toward the divine was one of the few things it consistently got right. He pushed open the wooden doors and stepped into the cool dim interior, past the pews where perhaps 40 people sat or knelt in various configurations of prayer, past the candles burning with that particular quality of desperate sincerity, and stopped before the altar. The priest who had been leading a quiet prayer turned and found Alexander Anderson standing in his aisle, 6 feet of blessed violence in a torn coat, green eyes burning with something that was either divine inspiration or its dangerous cousin. "Father," Anderson said, in Japanese that was suddenly and inexplicably perfect, a gift of the dimensional transit that he chose to interpret as divine provision. "Tell me about the one called Cell." The priest, to his considerable credit, did not flee. "You're not from here." "No. But I am here now, and I find that this world has a monster problem that its warriors appear to be approaching incorrectly." The people in the pews had turned. Some afraid. Some with the particular attention of people who had been praying for something to change and were considering whether this strange arrival constituted an answer. Anderson had seen that look before. He knew what it meant and what it required of him. He sat down in the front pew, which creaked under the solidity of him, and he listened. They told him about Cell. About the androids. About the years of escalating catastrophe that had defined this world's recent history. About the Dragon Balls, which caused Anderson's expression to cycle through several complex theological positions in rapid succession before settling on something carefully neutral. About Goku and Gohan and Vegeta and the others. Men and half-alien children who had appointed themselves the guardians of a world that no conventional authority could protect. "There are only hope," a woman in the third pew said. She was holding a rosary, Anderson noticed. A Catholic rosary, worn smooth with use. "Hope is not a strategy," Anderson said, "but not unkindly. And placing the fate of the innocent in the hands of warriors who answer to no authority beyond their own judgment is how civilizations make catastrophic errors." He paused. "I have some experience with this." He left them with a blessing that he suspected crossed several denominational boundaries but which he felt the circumstances justified, and stepped back into the sunlight. Cell's arena was visible from the edge of town, a distant geometric shape on the horizon, obscene in its deliberateness, a monster's theater built to frame a monster's entertainment. Anderson studied it for a long moment, his bayonets appearing and disappearing between his fingers in the unconscious fidget of a man accustomed to solving problems with consecrated steel. He had fought Alucard across 3 continents and a war. He had faced vampires, ghouls, and the Millennium Organization's army of artificial monsters. He had died twice in ways that should have been permanent and returned both times through faith and the pages of Magdalene. He did not consider himself easily impressed by evil. But Cell's energy, even at this distance, was something he hadn't encountered before. It wasn't demonic in any framework his training had given him. It wasn't spiritual corruption or infernal power. It was something biological and technological and deeply, fundamentally wrong, a perversion not of the soul but of potential itself, of the idea that life's purpose was to grow towards something worthy. Cell had grown towards something that had decided it was the destination. Anderson began walking toward the arena. Not because he had a plan. Not because the Z-fighters had asked him or because Alucard would have approved or because any tactical calculus suggested it was wise. He walked toward Cell's arena because there was a monster at the center of this world's suffering, and Alexander Anderson had never in his life walked away from a monster simply because the monster was powerful. His bayonets multiplied in his hands, dozens of them, each one catching the sunlight with a gleam that was somehow colder than the metal warranted. Behind him, 40 people watched from a church doorway. 3 of them were already on their knees. He didn't see them. He was already composing, in the back of his mind, the specific scripture he intended to quote when he introduced himself to something that called itself perfect. 1 Corinthians. Chapter 13. The part about what happens when you have all power and no love. It seemed appropriate. Cell was enjoying himself. This was, he had decided, the appropriate emotional state for a perfect being in the days before his tournament. He had constructed his arena with aesthetic consideration, the symmetry of the ring, the careful elevation that would allow optimal viewing angles, the open sky above that would frame the moment of his ultimate victory with appropriate grandeur. He had issued his challenge to the world. He had waited with the patience of something that understood it had already won and was simply allowing the narrative to reach its conclusion at a civilized pace. He was meditating at the center of his ring when he felt it. Not ki. He knew ki the way a musician knows their instrument, every variation, every signature, every flavor of power that the universe's fighters could produce. Goku's warm solar intensity. Vegeta's compressed volcanic fury. Gohan's vast, sleeping potential that Cell found simultaneously appetizing and concerning. He had absorbed enough fighters to recognize ki the way a sommelier recognizes wine, by character and origin and what it promised about the being producing it. This was not ki. It came from the north, moving at a pace that was fast for a human and utterly unremarkable by the standards of this world's fighters, and it registered on Cell's senses as a kind of negative space. Not an absence of power, but power operating on a frequency his absorbed genetic library had no reference for. He turned toward it with the precise, economical movement of something that had no unnecessary gestures in its repertoire, and waited. Anderson arrived at the arena's edge and stopped. They regarded each other across 50 meters of carefully maintained grass, and the air between them did something that air in the vicinity of 2 apex predators often does. It became very still and very attentive, as if the atmosphere itself understood that something significant was being established. "You built a theater," Anderson said. His voice carried without effort, the projection of a man accustomed to addressing congregations. "For your own glorification." Cell tilted his head with the precise, reptilian curiosity of something that had catalogued millions of fighting styles and was now encountering a variable outside its catalog. "You're not one of the Z-fighters. Your energy signature is entirely anomalous." A pause. "What are you?" "A servant of God." Anderson stepped onto the grass, bayonets appearing in both hands with the casual ease of long practice. "And you are an abomination." "Not in the spiritual sense, though I suspect that applies as well." "In the biological sense." "In the sense that you are something assembled rather than created, something that wears the shape of perfection without understanding what perfection requires." Cell smiled, which on his face was an elegant and deeply unnerving expression. "A philosopher. How refreshing." The humans I've encountered lately have limited their commentary to screaming. I'm not human. Not entirely. Anderson advanced slowly, the way a man walks into a burning building, with full knowledge of what he's approaching and the conscious decision that it doesn't change his trajectory. I've read about things like you. Not your specific configuration, your world has its own flavors of horror. But the category. The thing that accumulates power as a substitute for meaning. That mistakes capacity for purpose. Bold words from something I could end with a gesture. Anderson agreed. You probably could. He threw the first bayonet. Cell caught it between two fingers with the contemptuous ease of something that had caught bullets before, and examined it. The blessed steel smoked faintly against his palm, not burning, not causing damage, but reacting, producing a thin thread of something that registered on Cell's absorbed Saiyan senses as deeply wrong. He dropped it immediately, which was not a response he had anticipated giving. Interesting, he said, and his voice had shifted slightly, curiosity displacing performance. That weapon carries an energy I don't recognize. Not ki. Not any electromagnetic variant. He looked at Anderson with genuine attention for the first time. You're from somewhere else. Another world entirely. We arrived today. Anderson was already generating new bayonets, dozens of them floating in the air around him in a constellation of consecrated steel. Consider me an outside opinion on your tournament. And what is your outside opinion? That a being with genuine perfection would have no need to prove it. Cell was quiet for precisely 2 seconds. Then he moved, not his full speed, but enough, crossing the 50 meters between them in a blur and driving his fist toward Anderson's center mass with the force of a small explosion. Anderson took the hit. He went backward, boots tearing furrows in the grass, and hit the arena's stone wall with an impact that cracked it from top to bottom. Cell watched, already recalibrating. The power behind that blow should have ended a normal human being several times over. The energy it contained was enough to level a city block. Anderson peeled himself off the cracked stone, and his broken ribs were already knitting. His punctured lung was already reinflating. The bleeding stopped with the decisive efficiency of blessed regeneration that had been hardened through decades of combat and twice through death itself. He straightened his coat. That, Anderson said, hurt considerably. You're regenerating, Cell observed, and now his full attention was engaged, the performance entirely dropped. This was Cell in his truest mode, the scientist, the analyst, the being that had been designed to identify and consume valuable biological material. Rapid cellular regeneration. But it's not Saiyan. It's not Namekian. The energy signature is completely outside my genetic library. Because it comes from faith, not biology. Anderson raised his hands, and the constellation of bayonets rotated slowly around him like a lethal solar system. You cannot absorb what you cannot understand. Cell's eyes narrowed. I can learn to understand anything. So can I. Anderson launched the full constellation simultaneously. That's rather my point. The bayonets hit Cell from 40 directions, and while none of them caused meaningful damage to his perfect form, each one left that same faint smoking reaction on contact. Blessed steel meeting something it recognized as wrong in ways that Cell's absorbed ki couldn't simply dismiss or adapt to. Cell destroyed them with a burst of power, stood in the resulting cloud of consecrated fragments, and looked at Anderson with an expression that had moved past contempt into something more complicated. Alucard's voice came from directly behind Cell. Neither of them had heard him approach. Hello, the No-Life King said pleasantly. I heard there was a perfect being here. I've always found that claim worth investigating. Cell turned slowly. Alucard smiled. The two of them looked at each other, and something passed between them, a recognition, the way two deep ocean predators might acknowledge each other in the dark, and the air did that still, attentive thing again, but with considerably more intensity. You, Cell said carefully, are something different entirely. Yes, Alucard agreed. I am. Seras had not followed Alucard to the arena. This was partly because Alucard hadn't invited her, and partly because Seras Victoria had learned, through hard experience, that her master's solo reconnaissance missions tended to generate consequences that required managing from a distance. Someone had to maintain the perimeter. Someone had to think about what happened after. She had also, in the 20 minutes since Goku and Gohan had returned to their respective preparations, found herself in a conversation that she hadn't expected and couldn't quite bring herself to end. Krillin was not what she had anticipated from this world's fighters. She had calibrated her expectations based on Goku, that vast, friendly enormity of power, the easy confidence of something that had been tested to its absolute limit and discovered it had more. She had expected more of the same. What she found instead, sitting on the hood of an abandoned car at the highway's edge, eating from a bag of rice crackers he'd apparently been carrying in his GI for reasons he hadn't fully explained, was a man who was genuinely, straightforwardly human in every way that mattered, despite the fact that he could generate enough energy to flatten a mountain. "So you're a vampire," Krillin said, not with fear but with the particular tone of someone who had catalogued so many impossible things that one more simply joined the list. "Yes," Seras said. "And your master is the tall one in red who went off toward Cell's arena." "Yes. And nobody thought to stop him. Stopping Alucard requires either divine intervention or another Alucard, and we only have the one." She paused. "Anderson went that direction too." Krillin processed this. "The big guy with all the knives. He's a paladin. Catholic. He kills monsters for the Vatican. Does he know Alucard is a monster? They have a complicated relationship." Krillin ate a rice cracker and offered her the bag with the automatic generosity of someone who had spent years in communal living. She declined, but found the gesture oddly touching, the instinctive hospitality of a person who defaulted to kindness even in the shadow of potential apocalypse. "I can't feel your energy," he said. "Either of you. Any of you. I've been trying since you arrived and it's like," he made a gesture that described something just out of reach, like trying to hear a conversation through a wall. "I know something's there but I can't read it." "Our power doesn't come from Ki," Seras explained. She was watching the horizon, her vampire senses extended outward in a 3-kilometer sphere of awareness, monitoring her master's position and Anderson's and the enormous, wrongly assembled energy signature of Cell. "Where we come from, power has different sources. Alucard's comes from 5 centuries of surviving things that should have killed him and consuming the souls of everything that tried." She looked at her own darkness arm, the living shadow that occupied the space where her left arm had been before Zoran Blitz had taken it. "Mine comes from accepting what I am." "And what are you?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. A year ago she would have deflected. She would have said, a police officer or a Hellsing soldier or hidden behind some identity that felt safer than the true one. Alucard had spent considerable time, in his own chaotic, blood-soaked way, teaching her that deflection was a form of cowardice, and Seras Victoria had decided she was done being a coward. "I'm a predator," she said. "I was human and then I was changed, and for a long time I tried to be what I used to be because it was comfortable. But I'm not what I used to be. I'm something that has human memory and human feeling and something else layered on top of it that is very old and very powerful and sometimes very frightening." She paused. "I've mostly made my peace with that." Krillin nodded slowly. "I died," he said. "Twice. Well, more than twice, but twice in ways that really counted. The first time was when I was a kid in Piccolo." He stopped, reorganized. "It's a long story. But I know something about being changed by what you've survived." Seras looked at him properly for the first time, with the full attention of eyes that saw more than visible light. She read the key signature she couldn't fully translate, the physical markers her vampire perception could process, and saw what was genuinely there, a man who had been pushed past human limits repeatedly and had somehow remained, essentially and stubbornly, himself. No bitterness. No armor of cynicism. Just a person who had decided that the things that had happened to him didn't get to define what he was. She felt something she hadn't expected to feel since arriving in this universe. Kinship. Your friend, she said. Gohan. He's very young to carry this much weight. Krillin's expression shifted into something more complicated. 11. Going on 100. He was quiet for a moment. Everyone's looking at him like he's the answer. Like there's something inside him that's going to solve this. And there might be, I've felt it, that potential, it's genuinely enormous. But he's still a kid who'd rather be reading books, and sometimes I think we forget that. Seras thought about the children at the orphanage Anderson ran. She thought about the way violence had a particular quality when it was happening around people who hadn't chosen it and hadn't been built for it. She thought about Gohan, 11 years old, floating in the sky and assessing three-dimensional travelers with eyes that were too old for his face. The monsters in our world, she said carefully, they targeted children specifically. Because children are the thing adults will do anything to protect, and anything adults will do to protect something is also something that can be used against them. She watched the distant arena. Cell hasn't done that here. Not directly. But he's made an 11-year-old boy into a weapon and pointed him at a problem, and I'm not sure the people who love that child have fully reckoned with what that means. Krillin set down his rice crackers. No, he said quietly. I don't think we have. They sat in silence for a moment, a human who had died and returned and a vampire who had been unmade and rebuilt, watching the same distant horizon where something that called itself perfect was making its preparations. Seras felt the moment her master's energy shifted, that deep, oceanic change that meant Alucard had found something genuinely interesting. She stood up immediately. I need to be closer to the arena, she said. Krillin stood too, his hand moving to the point on his forehead where his key focus lived. Yeah, he said. Me too. They moved together toward the sound of something ancient meeting something that had never been ancient enough to know what it was facing. The devoured souls were screaming. Not audibly. Not in any register that Cell or Anderson or the distant observers could detect. But inside the vast internal architecture of Alucard's existence, that impossible space where millions of consumed psyches lived in permanent residence, the accumulated dead of 5 centuries of predation, something had changed the moment he stepped within 10 meters of Cell, and it had not changed back. Ki did that. He understood it now in a way he hadn't from a distance. At 40 kilometers it had been a curiosity, an unfamiliar frequency worth cataloging. Up close, with Cell's enormous power radiating outward in waves that bent the air and made the grass lie flat in concentric circles, Alucard could feel what Ki actually was at a fundamental level, life energy, the animating force of living things compressed and refined through training and will into something weaponizable. It was, in its essential nature, not entirely unlike the power he himself wielded. Except that Ki was life force moving outward, expressed, expendable. What Alucard contained was life force moving inward, consumed, accumulated. Millions of lives worth of energy compressed into one body that had spent 5 centuries learning not to be destroyed. The problem was that those millions of lives could feel Cell. The souls within him. Soldiers and monsters and innocents and the damned, every psyche he had ever swallowed and added to his internal collection, were reacting to Cell's Ki the way iron reacts to a magnetic field, except the reaction was not alignment but agitation. Cell's absorbed genetic material included the Ki signatures of hundreds of fighters, and those signatures were broadcasting outward constantly, and Alucard's devoured souls were responding to those broadcasts like prisoners hearing a familiar voice through a prison wall. It was destabilizing in a way that Alucard found genuinely, carefully interesting, and would not, under any circumstances, allow Cell to observe. You called yourself perfect, Alucard said, maintaining the conversation with the ease of someone whose internal crisis was entirely invisible externally. I've encountered that claim before. Millennium made it. The captain made it. Walter, toward the end, seemed to believe something similar. He tilted his head. They were all wrong, of course. Cell had not moved since Alucard appeared behind him. He was doing what apex predators do when they encounter something genuinely unfamiliar, processing, cataloging, running his absorbed genetic library against the data in front of him and finding the relevant entry conspicuously absent. Your biology is impossible, Cell said. It was not a complaint but an observation, delivered with scientific precision. Dead tissue that moves. Circulatory system that functions without a heartbeat. Neural activity in a body that has no metabolic process I can identify. He paused. You're not alive. Correct. But you're not dead either. Also correct. Then what are you? Alucard spread his hands in a gesture that encompassed the question and declined to fully answer it. Something your genetic library doesn't have a category for. Something that exists in the space between the states your biology recognizes. He smiled. It must be very frustrating. It was, Cell reflected, somewhat frustrating. Anderson had retreated to the arena's edge, not fled, retreated, with the tactical awareness of a fighter who understood the difference between his battle and someone else's. He was watching Alucard and Cell with the focused attention of a man who had spent decades learning to read conflicts, and what he was reading troubled him in ways he was reluctant to fully examine. Alucard was holding something back. Anderson knew his enemy. And Alucard was his enemy, would always be his enemy, their opposition was written into the nature of what they each were, with the particular intimacy of someone who had fought him repeatedly across years and continents and one catastrophic world war. He knew the rhythms of Alucard at full capacity. He knew the specific quality of Alucard's attention when he was genuinely engaged versus performing engagement. He knew the difference between Alucard enjoying a fight and Alucard managing a situation. This was management. Something was wrong inside the No-Life King, and he was not allowing Cell to see it. Anderson filed this information carefully and said nothing, because whatever was wrong with Alucard was not something he would exploit in front of a third party, and if that loyalty surprised him, he chose not to examine it too closely. Inside Alucard, the souls churned. The problem was specificity. Cell's absorbed fighters included key signatures from Piccolo, from Vegeta, from Goku himself. And Goku's key in particular was doing something to the devoured souls that Alucard had not anticipated. It was warm. That was the only word that applied, inadequate as it was. Goku's key signature, broadcast outward through Cell's power even in this degraded, absorbed form, was warm in a way that living energy almost never was. It was the key of someone who had died and returned and died again and returned again and never, through any of it, lost the essential quality that made him what he was. The souls within Alucard recognized that quality. They reached toward it. And in reaching, they pulled. Pulled at the boundaries of Alucard's control, at the containment structures he maintained through will and through the Cromwell restrictions, at the careful architecture of suppression that kept millions of psyches from expressing themselves simultaneously and turning him into something even he couldn't manage. He tightened the restrictions by 3 levels. The souls screamed louder. Cell took one step toward him, and Alucard held up one hand, not defensively, but with the precise, economical authority of someone who has issued an instruction and expects it to be followed. Not yet, Alucard said. Cell stopped. Not because the instruction compelled him. Because the confidence behind it was specific enough to warrant evaluation. In Cell's considerable experience, beings that said not yet with that particular quality of certainty were beings that had a reason for the timing. You're managing something, Cell said. I'm always managing something. Alucard lowered his hand slowly. I contain multitudes. Literally. And your presence is making them restless in ways I find worth understanding before we proceed. You want to study me. I want to understand what you are before I decide what to do about you. He paused. You want the same thing. That's why you haven't attacked. Cell was quiet for a moment. Then, with the grace of something that had decided patience was tactically sound, he sat down at the center of his arena and looked at Alucard with full, undivided scientific attention. Then let's understand each other, he said. Alucard sat across from him, 10 meters of charged air between them, and inside his vast internal architecture, he spent the next 40 seconds forcibly silencing several million restless dead. It was, he reflected, the most unusual meditation he had ever attempted. Vegeta had not been consulted. This was, in his view, the defining problem with the current situation. 3 beings of unknown power had arrived in his world through a dimensional rift, had immediately dispersed in separate directions, one toward Cell's arena, one into the civilian population, one on some independent trajectory that Vegeta's senses couldn't properly track. And nobody had thought to inform the Prince of all Saiyans until Gohan had mentioned it with the casual delivery of someone reporting weather. He had powered up to Super Saiyan immediately, because Vegeta's response to unexpected variables was always to ensure that whatever he was about to confront would find him at maximum capacity. Then he had flown north at speed, following the faint directional sense of something he couldn't properly read with his key perception but could feel as a pressure, a wrongness in the energy landscape that his Saiyan instincts flagged as significant. He found Anderson 3 kilometers from the arena, sitting on a concrete barrier, reading from a small book that he appeared to have produced from somewhere inside his coat. Vegeta landed 6 feet away and crossed his arms and said nothing, because Vegeta's approach to first contact was to establish dominance through silence and let the other party reveal themselves. Anderson turned a page. 30 seconds passed. You're going to stand there until I acknowledge you, Anderson said, without looking up. I've dealt with prideful men before. I find waiting them out is generally more efficient than engaging their expectations. Vegeta's eye twitched. Do you know who I am? A warrior of significant power who believes that power confers status. Anderson closed his book and looked up. The green eyes were calm with the particular calm of someone who had stared down things that would make most warriors reconsider their career. You carry yourself like a man who was born to rule and has spent considerable time being frustrated. That the universe hasn't properly acknowledged this. The accuracy of this assessment did not improve Vegeta's disposition. I am Vegeta, Prince of all Saiyans. He let the ki flare, just slightly, a controlled demonstration, Super Saiyan energy crackling around him in a corona of gold that bent the air and flattened the grass and did the things that Super Saiyan energy did when deployed for emphasis. And you are an anomaly in my world that requires explanation. Anderson stood, and while he was tall, he was not as tall as the impression he gave, and while he had no key signature that Vegeta could read, the lack of fear in his posture was complete and genuine. Vegeta had learned to distinguish performed fearlessness from actual fearlessness through extensive experience with both. This was actual. Alexander Anderson, the Paladin said. Servant of God. Agent of the Vatican's Iscariot organization. He produced a bayonet from nowhere and examined it with the casual familiarity of long use. And you are a prince without a kingdom, fighting to protect a world that was never yours by birth, because the alternatives are unacceptable to something in your character that you'd rather not examine too closely. The silence that followed had a very specific texture. You know nothing about me, Vegeta said, very quietly. I know warriors, Anderson replied. I've spent my life among them. The ones who fight for glory and the ones who fight for duty and the ones who fight because they've run out of other ways to answer the question of what they are. He looked at Vegeta steadily. You're the third kind. You started as the first. Something changed you. Vegeta powered down from Super Saiyan. This was not a concession. It was a recalibration. The recognition that whatever this conversation was, it wasn't a fight, and maintaining a combat transformation for a conversation was a waste of energy that Vegeta, who had once been profligate with such gestures, had learned to avoid. What changed you? Vegeta asked, and the question came out with less armor than he'd intended. Anderson was quiet for a moment. I was a child without anyone, he said. The organization gave me purpose. God gave me direction. Violence gave me expression. He paused. And then I encountered something so far beyond the scope of what my training had prepared me for that I had to decide, very quickly, whether my faith was in the institution or in something larger than the institution. And I'm still deciding. The bayonet disappeared. We are more alike than either of us would prefer. Vegeta made a sound that was not agreement but not denial either. They stood in silence for a moment, the Saiyan Prince and the Vatican Paladin, two beings who had been instruments of institutions and had survived the process of discovering that instruments have their own edges, and the silence was almost companionable. Then Vegeta felt it. A shift in Cell's energy signature, distant but unmistakable, the particular quality that Cell's power took on when his attention fully engaged, when the performance dropped and the predator underneath became visible. He had felt it before, during their own confrontation, and it had preceded violence with the reliability of a warning bell. Your companion, Vegeta said. The one in red. He's at the arena. Anderson was already looking south, his posture shifting from reflective to alert with the speed of long combat training. Alucard went to look at Cell. Cell will try to absorb him. Cell will try. Anderson's smile was small and specific. There are things inside Alucard that have been trying to absorb him for 5 centuries. They've all failed. Vegeta considered this. What is he? Truthfully. Anderson picked up his small book and tucked it back inside his coat. The closest thing our world has to an answer to the question of what survives when everything human is stripped away and only will remains. He began walking south. Whether that's a comfort or a horror depends entirely on what you were hoping humanity would be at its core. Vegeta fell into step beside him, which surprised them both. And what is it? Vegeta asked. At its core. Anderson was quiet for 20 steps. The arena was visible on the horizon, and something in Cell's energy signature had changed again, deeper, more focused, the quality of a predator that had found something worth its full attention. Hungry, Anderson said finally. At its core, what survives is hunger. The question every person answers differently is what they choose to feed. Vegeta said nothing. But his hand had moved, unconsciously, to the Saiyan crest on his armor, and Anderson, who noticed everything, noticed that. Cell made his move at dawn. Not against Alucard. Not against Anderson or Vegeta or any of the Z-fighters who had gathered at the arena's periphery over the course of the night, drawn by the gravitational pull of something significant happening at the center of their world's crisis. Cell was patient in the way that only something genuinely confident in its own outcome could be patient. He had spent the night in careful observation, cataloging, running assessments against his absorbed genetic library and finding the results simultaneously fascinating and incomplete. He moved against Seras. The logic was sound, by Cell's particular calculus. Alucard was an unknown that required more data before engaging. Anderson had demonstrated a resistance to conventional damage that made him expensive to fight without certainty of absorption potential. Vegeta and the Z-fighters were quantities he understood and had already assessed. But Seras Victoria occupied a category that Cell's analytical mind found irresistible. She was like Alucard, operating on the same impossible frequency, but younger. Less settled. The power within her was enormous and unfinished, still finding its shape, still negotiating the terms of what it was going to be. Unfinished things were easier to absorb than completed ones. He came from below, from underground, emerging through the arena floor in a column of displaced earth while Seras stood at the arena's edge discussing perimeter positions with Krillin. The movement was fast enough that Krillin's key sense registered it only as it was already completing, fast enough that the human nervous system's warning architecture had no time to translate perception into action. Seras's vampire perception was not a human nervous system. She was moving before Cell fully emerged, her darkness arm expanding outward in a wave of shadow that was not a defensive gesture but an offensive one, not blocking but reaching, the living darkness extending with the autonomous intelligence it had developed since she'd fully accepted it, wrapping around Cell's emerging form with the instinctive grip of something that understood, on a level below conscious thought, that what was coming needed to be contained immediately. Cell's absorption tail found her left arm. And the world changed. The absorption process was, by Cell's design, near instantaneous. His tail was engineered to process biological material faster than the subject's nervous system could register what was happening. He had absorbed hundreds of beings with it. He had taken Android 17 and 18 and felt the transformation into something greater than the sum of its parts. He had refined the process into something elegant and complete. What he encountered inside Seras Victoria's darkness was not biological material. It was a world. The darkness arm was not flesh. It was not cellular. It was compressed psychic energy, the accumulated remnant of Seras's former master Pip Bernadotte, his soul, his will, his selfhood, transformed by Seras's grief and power into something that had chosen to remain rather than dissipate. And Pip Bernadotte, in death as in life, was fundamentally ungovernable. Cell's absorption process hit Pip's resident soul and encountered resistance of a kind that had no precedent in his genetic library. Not physical resistance. Not key resistance. The resistance of a personality that had decided it was not going anywhere and had the metaphysical weight of genuine love behind that decision, the specific gravity of someone who had chosen to stay. Cell froze. Not paralyzed. Not damaged. Frozen in the specific way of a system encountering an input it cannot process, caught in the moment between contact and response while his absorbed library ran through every category it contained and found nothing that matched. Seras felt it too. She felt Cell's absorption attempt enter the darkness and stop. And she felt Pip, warm and familiar and stubbornly present as he always was, push back against something that had tried to consume him for the second time in his existence. The first time had been his own death. He had handled that by choosing to become something else. He handled this the same way. The darkness arm exploded outward. Not an explosion in the conventional sense. Not fire or concussive force, but a release of compressed psychic energy that expanded from the point of Cell's absorption contact in a sphere of pure black that turned the early morning light into something ancient and cold. Cell was thrown backward across his own arena, skipping across the ring's surface twice before catching himself, and what he felt as he slid was something he had not felt since the moments before he achieved his perfect form. Uncertainty. Seras stood at the arena's edge, her darkness arm extended to its full and enormous reach, her red eyes blazing with something that was beyond anger, the specific fury of someone whose most private self had been touched without permission. The darkness moved around her with autonomous agitation, Pip's presence amplifying her power in the way it always did when she stopped managing it and simply let it be what it was. "Don't," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that had nothing to do with human vocal cords. Krillin, 6 feet to her right, had generated a destructo disc on pure instinct and was holding it ready, his face pale but his hands steady. He had positioned himself between the arena and the civilian direction without thinking about it, the automatic geometry of someone who had always, without fanfare or announcement, put himself where he needed to be. Cell rose from the arena's surface and looked at Seras with full, undivided attention. "What," he said carefully, "is inside that arm?" "Someone who decided to stay," Seras said. Cell processed this. His tail retracted slowly, the absorption mechanism withdrawing with the deliberateness of something recalibrating rather than retreating. He had learned something in the last 30 seconds that his entire absorbed genetic library had not prepared him for, that there were forms of power in this dimensional visitor's arsenal that did not respond to the physics of his universe. That the darkness she carried was not an energy he could consume because it was not, in any fundamental sense, a physical energy at all. It was a choice. Made by someone who was dead. Maintained by someone who loved them. Cell had no category for that. Alucard arrived at the arena's edge with Anderson and Vegeta 2 seconds later, drawn by the energy release, and took in the scene with the swift assessment of someone who had managed crisis for 5 centuries. His eyes moved from Cell to Seras to the expanded darkness arm to the specific quality of Seras's expression. He said nothing. But something in his posture shifted. A slight adjustment, a realignment, the subtle change of a being who had just updated a fundamental assessment. He had always known Seras was becoming something significant. He had watched the process with the particular attention of someone who understood transformation from the inside. He had not, until this moment, understood how complete the transformation had become. Cell looked at Alucard across the arena. "The absorption doesn't work on you either," Cell said. It was not a question. "Nothing works on me," Alucard said pleasantly. "That's rather the point." Cell looked at the three of them, Alucard, Seras, and the distant Anderson approaching with Vegeta, and performed the calculation that his perfect mind was designed to perform. The variables. The unknowns. The specific quality of power that these dimensional travelers carried, power that his absorbed library could not categorize and therefore could not counter with certainty. For the first time since achieving his perfect form, Cell revised his tournament plans. Not cancelled. Revised. The Cell games would proceed. But the parameters had changed, and Cell, who had always been, beneath the performance of perfection, a scientist, understood that changed parameters required changed methodology. He looked at the dawn sky above his arena and made a decision that surprised him. "I want to understand what you are," he said to Alucard. "Before this ends." "Then you have approximately 12 hours, Alucard said. "The tournament begins tomorrow." "Yes." Cell looked at Seras once more, and the look contained something that had not been there before, not respect, exactly, but the specific attention of a being that had encountered a genuine unknown. "It does." The Cell games began at noon. The sun was directly overhead, which Cell had arranged deliberately, maximum visibility, optimal light for the cameras that were still broadcasting to whatever remnant of global media infrastructure remained functional. He stood at the center of his ring with the composed authority of something that had decided the day's events were already written and was simply presiding over their execution. He was wrong about that. Goku fought first. Seras watched from the arena's edge beside Krillin, and what she witnessed in the opening exchange recalibrated every assessment she had made about this world's power scale since arriving. Goku moved at speeds that her vampire perception, which could track bullets and react to explosions, struggled to follow completely. The energy releases from their exchanges hit the surrounding landscape like artillery, each block strike carrying enough force to level the buildings of a city block, the shockwaves rolling outward in concentric rings that flattened the grass and rattled teeth at a kilometer's distance. She had thought she understood power. She had fought Zoran Blitz and the Millennium Army. She had stood in the burning ruin of Hellsing Manor and held the line with Pip beside her and the darkness finally, fully accepted inside her. She had watched Alucard unmake an army of 1 million souls in London streets. This was different. This was power expressed physically, ki weaponized into something that bent the visible world, that made the air itself a casualty of the conflict. And Goku, fighting at what she understood to be significant but not maximum capacity, was doing it with a quality of joy that she found simultaneously alien and deeply moving, a man who loved what he was even in the middle of something terrible. Cell matched him. Cell exceeded him. Cell revealed, in the patient escalation of their exchange, that he had been holding reserves that Goku's senses hadn't fully detected, and when those reserves expressed themselves, the quality of the fight changed, became heavier, more desperate, the gap between them widening in ways that Goku's expression registered with the honest transparency of a man who did not perform emotions he wasn't feeling. Goku stepped out of the ring. The silence that followed had weight. "Gohan," Goku said. Seras felt Krillin stop breathing beside her. The boy dropped from the sky and landed at the ring's edge, and he was 11 years old and he was terrified, and he was also, Seras's perception told her, something that had not yet fully understood what it was. The potential inside him was not like Goku's warm solar ki. It was colder. Vaster. The specific quality of power that has never been fully expressed and exists in a state of enormous compressed tension, like a fault line that has not yet moved but contains within it the energy of every earthquake it has been storing. Cell looked at Gohan. Gohan looked at Cell. Anderson appeared at Seras's left shoulder with the silence of a man who had learned to move quietly through 30 years of operational violence. He had been watching from the structure's far edge, maintaining his distance from Alucard with the habitual discipline of their permanent opposition, but something had drawn him here for this moment. "The child," he said quietly. "I know," Seras said. "They're going to hurt him. Deliberately. To make him angry. I know." "That is," Anderson said, and his voice carried something that the Vatican's operational doctrine had no official term for but that Seras recognized as the specific grief of a man who ran orphanages, unconscionable. The Cell Juniors came first. 7 of them, spawned with casual brutality, dispatched against the Z-Fighters with the explicit purpose of generating the specific emotional frequency that would unlock what Cell's absorbed Saiyan genetics told him was hiding inside Gohan. They were fast. Powerful. Sufficient to overwhelm fighters whose key signatures Seras had been reading for 2 days, and watching Krillin go down, watching the man who had shared rice crackers and genuine human warmth with her take damage that crumpled him against the arena's stone with a sound she felt in her chest, did something to her internal architecture that bypassed tactical thinking entirely. She was moving before she completed the thought. The darkness arm extended 40 meters and closed around 2 Cell Juniors simultaneously, and what it did to them was not violence in any conventional sense but something older, compression, the specific crushing weight of darkness that had learned from Pip Bernadotte how to hold something and not let go. They struggled with the frantic energy of ki-charged creatures suddenly encountering a force their bodies had no response to. Alucard stepped into the ring. Cell turned from Gohan to look at him, and in Cell's expression was the full complexity of their 2 days of conversation, the scientific fascination, the predatory assessment, the genuine uncertainty that the no-life king had generated in something that had believed itself beyond uncertainty. "This isn't your fight," Cell said. "No," Alucard agreed. He walked to the ring center with his hands in his coat pockets, and the souls within him were no longer screaming. They had been screaming for 2 days, agitated by ki, destabilized by the dimensional friction between their nature and this universe's physics, and sometime in the night, between Cell's attempted absorption of Seras and this morning's preparations, something had shifted. The souls had stopped fighting the ki around them. They had started absorbing it. Not the way Cell absorbed, not consumption, not assimilation, not the violent annexation of another being's distinctiveness into a collective whole. The souls within Alucard were doing what Alucard himself had spent 5 centuries doing. They were surviving something that should have unmade them, and in surviving, becoming something that incorporated the new environment rather than being destroyed by it. Goku's warm ki, broadcast through Cell's power and through the ambient energy of a world that had been shaped by decades of ki-using fighters, had been slowly absorbed into Alucard's internal architecture for 48 hours. He had not fully understood what that meant until this moment. He reached inward and felt it, millions of souls, each one carrying now a trace of ki alongside their original spiritual energy, a hybrid resonance that existed in neither register alone but somewhere between them, in the space that Alucard had always occupied between states. He released restriction level 0. The Cromwell limitation lifted with the specific quality of something very large that has been held in compression for a very long time finally being allowed to express its actual volume. The darkness came first, the familiar ocean of shadow that poured from Alucard like blood from a wound, covering the arena and extending beyond it, turning the noon sunlight into something filtered and ancient. Then the souls came, millions of them, a tide of psychic energy that rose above the arena in a column visible from kilometers away. But threaded through all of it, woven into the darkness and the souls and the impossible architecture of what Alucard was at his absolute limit, was something gold. Ki. Absorbed and transformed. Hybrid energy that the universe had never produced before. The marriage of death power and life force in a being that existed between states and had, apparently, decided that this new universe's fundamental energy was worth incorporating rather than resisting. Cell looked at what Alucard had become in this moment, and for the first time in his existence, the perfect being took a step backward. Not from fear. Cell had processed fear and moved beyond it as part of his development. What he stepped back from was something his absorbed library genuinely could not categorize, could not counter, could not adapt to, because it was not a power level or a technique or a biological capability. It was a principle. The principle that survival, genuine survival, means becoming something that incorporates everything it has encountered rather than being destroyed by it. Anderson's voice came from the arena's edge, quiet enough for only Alucard to hear. "Don't kill him," the paladin said. "That's not ours to do. This world has its own accounting to make." Alucard stood at the center of his released darkness, gold threaded through the black, millions of hybrid souls burning in the column above him, and considered that instruction from the one being whose opinion he would not admit to valuing and could not entirely dismiss. He closed his hand. The darkness compressed. The souls drew back. The gold faded to a trace, integrated, settled. He left enough of the release active to ensure Cell's full and complete attention remained on him and away from Gohan. And from the arena's edge, Gohan watched what Alucard had become, and something in the 11-year-old's vast compressed potential responded to it, not to the power, but to the principle. The idea that what you've survived becomes part of what you are, and what you are is always more than what you were before the surviving. The potential inside Gohan cracked open. What came out of Gohan was not anger. Everyone had expected anger. Cell had engineered for anger, had calculated the precise sequence of provocations required to unlock what his absorbed Saiyan genetics told him lived inside this child, the specific emotional trigger that transformed Saiyan potential from extraordinary into something beyond the scale his perfect form had been designed to handle. He had hurt Gohan's friends. He had created the Cell Juniors. He had applied pressure to every relationship the boy valued, because Cell understood, with the cold precision of something assembled from the greatest fighters in the universe, that Saiyans unlocked their deepest power through emotional extremity. What emerged from Gohan was not anger. It was grief transformed into clarity. Seras recognized it before anyone else did, because she had felt something similar in the burning ruin of Hellsing Manor with Pip dying in her arms and the Millennium Army outside the walls and the darkness waiting inside her for the moment she stopped being afraid of it. The moment where everything you've been holding against yourself finally becomes everything you are, and the becoming is not rage but acceptance, vast, cold, and absolutely without limit. Gohan's ki rose. The scale of it silenced everything. Cell's composed authority faltered. The Cell Juniors that Seras still held in her darkness arms stopped struggling and simply hung there, stunned by the energy washing outward from the 11-year-old boy standing at the center of the ring. Vegeta, who had powered to Super Saiyan on instinct, felt his own considerable power become momentarily irrelevant. Not overwhelmed, simply contextually small, the way a candle becomes contextually small when someone opens the curtains at noon. Alucard watched with his restriction still partially released, gold-threaded darkness moving around him in slow currents, and what he felt from Gohan's ascending ki was something that resonated with the hybrid energy now integrated into his internal architecture. The warmth of it. Not Goku's specific warmth, this was different, younger, rawer, the warmth of something that had never been anything other than what it was and was only now discovering the full scope of that. Super Saiyan 2 announced itself to the world with a thunderclap that had no thunder in it. Cell fought. Of course Cell fought. He was perfect, he was designed, he was the assembled apex of everything this world's greatest fighters had ever been, and he met Gohan's ascending power with everything he had accumulated and refined and perfected over the course of his engineered existence. The exchange that followed was not like Goku's fight. It did not have that quality of matched competitors finding each other's rhythms. It was Cell throwing everything he possessed against something that had moved beyond the scale his design had anticipated, and discovering, blow by blow, that there are things you cannot engineer your way past. Gohan hit Cell with the specific quality of someone who had stopped holding back not because they'd decided to let go but because the container had simply ceased to exist. Anderson watched from the arena's edge and said nothing. He had put away his bayonet sometime during Gohan's ascension, which was not a gesture of defeat but of recognition, the recognition that this was not his fight, had never been his fight, that he and Alucard and Seras had arrived in this world as witnesses as much as participants, and that what was happening at the center of this ring was something this world needed to do for itself. Krillin had recovered. Battered, moving carefully, but present. Standing at the arena's edge with the stubborn permanence of someone who had decided that bearing witness was itself a form of contribution. He looked at Seras, who stood beside him with her darkness arms slowly retracting. The Cell Juniors she'd held now irrelevant given what was happening in the ring. Will he win? Seras asked. Krillin watched Gohan dismantle Cell's perfect form with the systematic thoroughness of something that had moved beyond technique into pure expression. Yeah, he said quietly. Yeah, he's going to win. Cell, in his desperation, made the error that Cell's design had always contained as an inevitability. He pushed beyond his limits in the wrong direction, his power spiking in the detonation attempt that his absorbed Saiyan cells had always carried as a last resort, the final expression of a being that had confused destruction with transcendence. Goku made his choice. The instant transmission carried him and Cell away from the arena, and what followed was something Seras felt as a distant concussion, a vast energy release at coordinates her senses placed somewhere far removed, and then the particular quality of silence that follows something irreversible. Goku did not return. The silence at the arena lasted 11 seconds. Then Gohan landed at the ring's center, Super Saiyan 2 fading from him like a tide going out, leaving behind a boy with his father's eyes and his mother's grief already forming behind them, and the world began the process of understanding what had just happened and what it had cost. Alucard released the last of his restriction. The darkness withdrew. The soul settled. The gold-threaded hybrid energy folded back into his internal architecture with the quiet efficiency of something returning to its resting state, and he stood in the noon sunlight in his red coat and his ridiculous hat and looked like nothing more than a tall man with orange glasses, which had always been the most dangerous thing about him. Anderson came to stand beside him. They stood in silence for a moment, watching Gohan, watching Vegeta's controlled expression manage something enormous, watching Krillin move toward the boy with the specific intention of someone who understood that what was needed right now was not strength but presence. We should go back, Anderson said. Yes. Our world has its own accounting. It always does. Seras joined them, and the three of them stood together at the edge of a world that had just saved itself at enormous cost, and felt the dimensional mathematics of their situation. The rift that had brought them here had been a single occurrence, an unrepeatable tear, and the path back required something they had not yet identified. Bulma found them there an hour later, because Bulma's response to every impossible situation was to apply sufficient intelligence to it until it became a possible situation, and she had been running sensor analysis on the dimensional anomaly since the moment it closed. She explained the solution with the efficient directness of someone who had grown up around people for whom the impossible was simply Tuesday. The energy release from Gohan's transformation created a secondary resonance in the dimensional membrane, she said, pushing her hair back and looking at her scanner. It won't last long. Maybe 2 hours. But there's a window. If you have something that can generate a corresponding frequency. Alucard reached into his coat and produced the jackal, which generated exactly the kind of anomalous energy that Bulma's scanner immediately identified as dimensionally relevant. She stared at the gun. That will absolutely work, she said. That's insane, but it will absolutely work. Anderson performed a blessing over the ground where they stood, which he felt the circumstances warranted, and Seras said goodbye to Krillin with the specific efficiency of someone who understood that prolonging the moment wouldn't improve it. "Take care of him," she said, meaning Gohan, meaning the boy standing at the arena's center with the weight of what he'd had to become settling onto shoulders that were still growing into their full width. "Always," Krillin said. The rift opened where Alucard fired, tearing the same wound in dimensional space that had deposited them here 48 hours earlier, and the three of them stepped through with the particular quality of beings who had arrived unexpectedly and were leaving changed, not transformed, not redirected, but carrying something new in the internal architecture of what they were. The last thing Seras saw before the rift closed was Vegeta. He was standing apart from the others, arms crossed, watching the dimensional tear with an expression that she had learned, over 2 days, to read accurately. Not contempt. Not calculation. The specific expression of a man who has encountered something that has confirmed a thing he already knew but hadn't fully accepted. He caught her eyes in the last moment before the closure. He nodded. She nodded back. The rift sealed. The story of Alucard, Seras Victoria, and Alexander Anderson's passage through the Dragon Ball Z universe ends not with a battle won or a world saved, those were never truly theirs to claim. It ends with something quieter and more permanent, the specific change that occurs in beings who have encountered something genuinely outside the scope of their experience and survived the encounter with their essential nature intact. Alucard returned to his world carrying gold in his darkness. Ki woven into the fabric of his devoured souls, a hybrid energy that had no name in either universe's vocabulary. The souls within him were different now, not quieter exactly, but settled in a new configuration, their ancient restlessness replaced by something that incorporated the warmth of a world that had decided life force was worth expressing outward rather than consuming inward. Whether this changed what Alucard was in any fundamental sense remained, as most things about the no-life king, genuinely uncertain. He did not appear to find this troubling. Seras returned understanding something about completion, that what she carried in her darkness arm was not a remnant but a presence, not grief preserved but love expressed in the only form available to it after death. Pip Bernadotte had pushed back against Cell's absorption with the full weight of a soul that had chosen to remain, and in doing so had demonstrated to Seras, finally and irrevocably, that what lived in her darkness was not a burden she carried but a partnership she inhabited. Anderson returned with his small book and his bayonets and his faith, which had encountered a universe that ran entirely on principles his theology had no category for and had emerged not diminished but expanded. The particular expansion that occurs when genuine faith confronts genuine mystery and discovers that mystery was always part of the proposition. They had witnessed a father sacrifice himself for his son. They had watched an 11-year-old boy carry a weight that no child should carry and carry it anyway because the alternatives were unacceptable. They had stood at the edge of a world's crisis and understood, each in their own way, that some battles belong to the people whose world is at stake, and the most meaningful contribution an outsider can make is to hold the line long enough for those people to find what they already contained. Somewhere in the Dragon Ball universe, in the silence after the Cell games, a boy stood at an arena's center and began the long process of becoming someone who had done what was necessary and would spend the rest of his life deciding what to do with that. And in the darkness between dimensions, 3 monsters made their way home. Live long and prosper. More stories await.